you all from wherever you're joining in from. So another week and another exciting session for us today. But before we start, let's start off with a prayer, as we do here in the Pacific. Always start off with a prayer. And so wherever you are, I ask to join me in prayer. Thank you, Father, for this wonderful afternoon here in Samoa, for this wonderful opportunity that we come together to share knowledge and learn. These opportunities are greatly needed and appreciated by all. And so we are very thankful that you give us these opportunities. And we pray that you help us to learn more so that we can help our countries, our governments to protect our environment and also our people. And so we thank you for always taking care of us and your blessings over us. And also to our presenters for today, we thank you for everything that you do in our lives, and we give you all the glory. In Jesus' mighty name we say, amen.
Amen.
Okay, before we start our program today, everyone, just some reminders. As always, our internet connection goes on and off, and so just be mindful of that. Zoom is very good at it locks you back in, so just be aware of that. Also, remember all our training notes, PowerPoint presentations, and our videos will be uploaded on our PNEA portal, and you are able to access that information freely. If you're not registered, please go and register so that you can access that information. Also, and very importantly, please remember to fill in your evaluation survey form. The link will be put on the in our chat box. Just click on it and fill it in as soon as you can after this training, because this is what is going to help you obtain your certificates, your training certificates. So please, that is very important. Don't forget to do that. And yes, that's about it on our reminders. And now for our topic today, just going over our training plan and just going over the narrative and the reason behind our module today, which is titled Waste Management and Pollution Control Throughout the Project Lifecycle in the Pacific. So just reading here from our training plan. Increasing waste and pollution is a regrettable consequence of development throughout the Pacific. This problem is exacerbated by the limitations in lands and technology available to Pacific Island countries to effectively manage waste and control pollution. Waste is both an economic as well as an environmental issue. Economic activities and urbanization often generate pollution to air, water, and land, and consume finite resources that may threaten people, ecosystem services, and the surrounding environment. Conversely, waste management and pollution control also offers a significant opportunity to invest. Its high visibility means that any improvements quickly become apparent. Managing resources efficiently through collaborative partnerships can forge lasting partnerships between governments, businesses, and local communities. To address problems associated with waste and pollution, the World Bank, through its third Environment and Social Standard, ESS 3, has set out requirements to address resource efficiency and pollution prevention and management throughout the project's life cycle, consistent with global international industry practice. In setting the context for this module, learning will be delivered to explain guidance notes for resource efficiency and preventative management in key areas of ESS3, as well as drawing on examples from water and sanitation projects across the Pacific. And so our learning objectives, firstly, is to introduce participants to the scope and requirements of the World Bank's ESS3, resource efficiency and pollution prevention and management. 2, explain guidance for resource efficiency in energy, water, and raw material use. 3, explain guidance on preventative management for air pollution, hazardous and non-hazardous waste, chemicals and hazardous materials, and pesticides. And 4, discuss the application of ESS3 in water and sanitation projects from the region. And so our presenters or trainers for today, our lead presenters from the World Bank are Ms. Bonnie Cavanaugh. She is the environment specialist from the World Bank with extensive Pacific experience. She is joined by Ms. Rieko Kubota. Rieko is connecting from Japan, and she is the senior environmental engineer specialized on waste or plastic management and circular economy. And then we also have our co-presenters, Mr. Alan Sewell, not a stranger to our PLP-ESS trainings. He is an environment specialist consultant for ADB. And finally, we have our SPREP co-presenter, Mr. Bradley Nolan. He's connecting from Australia, and he is the program manager for Pack Waste Plus. And so we are very blessed to have this team of trainers and presenters today with all their extensive experience. We are very blessed to have them share with us today. And so thank you very much for availing your time, and we are all looking forward to your presentations today. And so without any further ado, I will now hand it over to Ms. Bonnie, who is going first. And thank you very much for your patience. Akitsai.
Thanks very much, Shafira. Hi, everyone. My name is Bonnie Kavanagh, and I'm an environmental specialist with the World Bank, and I work on the Tonga and Solomon Island portfolios of the World Bank. So I think I can see some names in the participant list already who I know and work with. So nice to see you all, and thank you for joining the training. Throughout the session, I'm going to share my screen momentarily, but if you wanted to type any questions or comments in the chat, I won't be able to see it as I'll be sharing my screen, but maybe someone can interrupt me and ask any questions and give you the opportunity to speak if you prefer to unmute and speak. So I might share my screen now. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, Bonnie.
Fantastic. So my presentation today, I'm going to focus on ESS3, so that's resource efficiency and pollution prevention and management, which is part of the World Bank's environmental and social framework, which applies to all new World Bank projects. So this session is going to be quite specific to World Bank projects and what is contained and required within ESS3. But after that, I'm going to hand over to Alan from ADB, who will give more of a practical session on practical measures to control construction, pollution and waste. And then Alan's going to hand back to Rieko from the World Bank, who will talk a little bit about solid waste management on World Bank projects and our guiding documents and guidelines. And then we're going to finish with Bradley from SPREP, who will talk a little bit more about ESS and waste management projects in the Pacific specifically, and the Pack Waste project specifically. So we'll cover a few different aspects. And for those who don't work on World Bank projects, don't worry, we're not going to focus on ESS 3 specifically and how it applies to World Bank projects. The whole session, there will be, I think, things that apply to all projects and all kind of fields throughout the session. So I'll move on now. So environmental and social standard number 3, the objectives of this standard are to promote the sustainable use of resources, and that includes energy, water, and raw materials such as wood for buildings, aggregate for road projects. That's what we mean when we say raw materials. Also to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on human health and the environment caused by pollution from project activities, to avoid or minimize project-related emissions of short and long-lived climate pollutants, to avoid or minimize generation of hazardous and non-hazardous waste, and to minimize and manage the risks and impacts associated with pesticide use. So the standard is broken down into different sections, and I'm going to run through each section and tell you how it will apply to World Bank projects. But just in case anyone hasn't worked on a World Bank project under the ESF before, as I assume many people haven't yet, when the project is being prepared in the preparation stage, we complete an environmental and social assessment and assess the risk of the project against the World Bank's ESF, Environmental and Social Framework. And at that stage, you will determine which standards apply to your project, what risks exist under each standard, and then you'll propose some management measures and strategies that you'll implement during the project to manage these risks. So I'll go through how you will do that in the next section, but it will be broken down into resource efficiency, in terms of energy, water, and raw materials, the management of air pollution, management of wastes, management of chemicals, and the management of pesticides if pesticides apply. Now, ESS 3 refers to both national law, good international industry practice, and the World Bank environmental health and safety guidelines. So there's some backing, some guiding documents behind our environmental and social framework also. So I'll move through now onto the first aspect, which is energy use. So this applies to facilities or projects that will consume energy, which many of our projects will do so in a limited way. It might be quite, many of our projects in the Pacific are quite small, so it might be that your project is funding a new office building, and this will, it says, what should we do? When you're thinking about building a new, for example, office building or whatever your project is going to be, you should be thinking about how you can minimize energy use, maximize resource efficiency. So you can see there's some guidance in the World Bank EHS guidelines, and there are benchmarks provided by industry associations and international organizations. But in a practical sense, think about the scale of your project and what you could possibly do to improve energy efficiency, whether that's installing energy efficient light bulbs might be something that's practical, or consider including solar panels on a rooftop of your building, that sort of thing. So really important to note that the World Bank Environmental and Social Framework is meant to be scalable to the level of your project. So when you're working on smaller projects, think about what is financially feasible and what is practical and what makes sense, and do whatever you can, but obviously scale to your project. So I'll move on now to water use. Now, for projects with significant use of water, there is a requirement to assess potential cumulative impacts of water use upon communities, other users, and the environment. So that means if you're working on the preparation of a project where you will be using a lot of water, so for example, if you're working on an agricultural project and you'll be implementing or installing irrigation systems, you need to do, when you do your environmental assessment, you need to consider what will the impact of that water use have upon the community, you know, and make sure that you've assessed that risk and identified what is a sustainable amount of water to be using on your project. You also need to consider, will your project have an impact on water quality? And we need to, in a practical sense, minimize the impacts of our projects on water quality by reducing any runoff, controlling your pollutant sources, and potentially treating contaminated water before it's discharged off the site. So in practical terms, one project example that I can think of that could apply to is we have one project we're funding that's under ESF, where we're building slaughter blocks or abattoirs. And for that project, during preparation, we have had to assess what the potential impacts on water quality are. So that would be, you know, managing the animal waste from those animals, managing the high nutrient runoff that will, you know, come from a slaughter site when you're hosing down, you know, blood and whatever else off that site. And we've had to propose how we will manage that. And that's really how you apply ESS3 practically, is considering how you'll manage that risks and minimize it to water quality. And also here, there's the opportunity to consider resource efficiency measures. So similar to the last slide, if you're building a project that will use water, and one example that we have a lot in the Pacific is where we're building wash facilities, consider using resource efficient measures. You know, is there the possibility to use saltwater toilets? I know in many cases it's not practical, but consider, you know, are there ways that we can install toilets that use less water, considering water is such a precious resource in the Pacific? I'll move on now. Raw material use. This is another one that's, sorry, was someone trying to come in?
Sorry, Bonnie. I think someone has their mic unmuted. Let me just find that. You can proceed.
No worries. I couldn't hear very well, so I wasn't sure if they were trying to ask a question. So resource efficiency as it relates to raw material use. So projects where they make use of raw materials. So a big example would be if you're working on a road project where you need to source road aggregate, if you're working on buildings where you need to source wood, port projects where you need to source stone and aggregate, or airport projects if you're refinishing a runway. Under ESS3, you are required to assess the source of the raw materials you'll be using. So that means making sure that you're procuring stone from a permitted quarry, from a legal source. And it's really good to think about sustainable sourcing of materials. So consider, you know, we shouldn't be sourcing sand that's been mined from beaches. You know, that isn't a sustainable source of material. Where possible, we should avoid unsustainable material sources and make sure we're sourcing from, definitely sourcing from legal sources, you know, that wood has been legally sourced and legally cut down and isn't from a legal operation. So moving on to air pollution. So consider this one really for our projects. The applicability is, consider when you're building new offices or facilities, consider energy efficiency, try and reduce your emissions that way, you know, energy efficient lighting, potentially installation of renewable energy sources. Make sure you are thinking about waste management. If you're procuring materials, technology, consider how you're going to dispose of that technology at the end of the life of your technology, and also try and select materials that contain less pollutants, so lead-free paints, non-mercury bulbs, that sort of thing. moving on now, there is a requirement under Environmental and Social Standard 3 to estimate greenhouse gas emissions for your project at the preparation stage. So when you're preparing a project, ESS 3 does ask you to estimate how much GHG your project will emit over its lifetime. Now, there are some exceptions, and in many cases in the Pacific, we don't need to complete this estimation. So if you're working on a project that will have diverse and small sources of emissions, so for example, any kind of community-driven infrastructure project where you have small grants, for example, that are going to various different communities and they're doing very small things, you won't need to necessarily estimate the greenhouse gas emissions. Or if you're doing a project where emissions are unlikely to be significant, for example, social development projects, child nutrition, education projects, that sort of thing, there won't be a requirement to estimate your emissions. And it does allow that you only need to do this where it is technically and financially feasible. Though if you find you're working on a project that will have some greater emissions, potentially, a new road project, a new highway project, and you do not have the technical ability to estimate this, the World Bank can assist, and that's something that will be discussed during project preparation. So moving on now, ESS 3 also deals with pest management, and really under the objectives of the ESS, we try to avoid the use of pesticides. If you do need to use pesticides on your project, for example, for agricultural projects, you might need to produce a management plan for the use of those pesticides. And it also relates to, is there any ability for your project to introduce pests to a new area? And there's the requirement to think about that. So one that comes up occasionally on our projects is, for example, in the Solomon Islands, if you will be sourcing materials from an area that has a giant snail outbreak, consider how you can do so in a way that means you won't be introducing African giant snails to a new area. So that's just one example. Now I'm almost finished with my presentation, but I might pause here and see if there are any questions or clarifications.
Anyone have any questions at this point? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
If not, feel free to type in the chat as well if you don't want to unmute yourself. I know I've covered a lot of content very quickly, so I might start talking about this slide, but if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat while I'm talking, and I'll pause again once I finish with this slide. So the final aspect of ESS 3 that I wanted to briefly cover is historical pollution. So where you are working on a site where there is potential for historical pollution, so that an example of that might be if you, the classic example is if there is a petrol station and you're now repurposing that site and you've had underground tanks, fuel tanks buried on that site, and now you want to use it for something else. ESS 3 requires that you consider any potential for historical pollution. And I've got another slide which goes into a little bit more detail on this. So where you identify that there could be historical pollution, you're required to undertake a risk assessment and consider, is there any risk to human health and safety or the environment? So that should be completed before you undertake any kind of works on that site. And this should be completed following a risk-based approach consistent with good international industry practice. The World Bank Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines also provide some guidance on this process, as do the environmental and social framework. So there is material available to guide you on this. once you've identified that there is historical pollution, there is a risk, ESS 3 encourages borrowers to identify who is responsible for that and consider seeking recourse from them and trying to get them to help fund and remediate the site. In some cases, that can be really difficult. Depending on local legislative frameworks and enforcement, it can be really hard to do that. But either way, whether you are able to get them involved in the remediation, whoever is responsible or not, it's essential that adequate measures are used to manage health and safety risk and risk to the environment before you undertake any works on site. So that's the end of my presentation. I wondered.
Bonnie, hi. We have a question here from Margaret. How do you address countries where there are no standards? For example, water quality for marine and freshwater.
Thanks, Margaret. So there is a little bit of flexibility here. Where a country doesn't have standards, so in the first instance, we would defer to the World Bank environmental health and safety guidelines, and we do have some standards contained within those guidelines which can apply to projects. In some cases, particularly if we're working with multiple development partners, or potentially you're working with a consultant who is, for example, from Australia or New Zealand and is very familiar with their guidelines and thinks that they would be a better resource. The environmental and social framework requires good international industry practice. So if you have a guidance that you prefer and you can show that it is more stringent than the World Bank environmental health and safety guidelines standards, then happy to consider the use of those standards. So a little bit of flexibility, but making sure that those standards, that we are complying with good international industry practice on all of our projects.
Thanks, Bonnie. That's the only question we have here in the chat box.
Fantastic. Any last questions or comments, everyone? I'll pause for a moment, and if not, I'll hand over to the next speaker. Anyone?
We have one from Marista. What about cumulative pollution impacts of ongoing activities within the proposed project site? Is this considered under historical pollution risks?
Great question. Hi, Marista. Thanks for the question. Yes. So if you are taking over a site, let me try and think of an example. If there is already, I'll go back to my abattoir example. There's already an abattoir on your site, and now you've come in and you want to install something else on that site. You want to install a building, and you note that there is, there's runoff coming from that abattoir into a stream next to your building. I think it's very important to consider that historical pollution and undertake that process, identify if there are any risks to your project, to your workers or the environment, and start that process of trying to ask that person, whoever is operating within the site, to take responsibility for their own contamination and remediate it. I think it's better to do that before you start construction if possible, and really clearly delineate who's done what and who's responsible for what contamination, and try and at the very minimum make sure you're not posing a risk to your workers.
Very good. Okay, we have another question, Bonnie, from Aminiasi. What are common barriers to implementing waste diversion programs?
Sure, thank you, Aminiasi. I guess in the Pacific, there are many barriers, and I guess the lack of infrastructure is a huge barrier in the Pacific. So really, when we're talking about waste diversion, reuse is a great option, particularly, if you have within a community. One thing we found on some projects is where we have leftover aggregate from road projects, we find that actually the community are often happy to take that, and they have things they want to use that for. So finding clever ways to divert waste and reuse it wherever possible, I think is essential, because in many cases, you know, there's very limited infrastructure to deal with waste and recycling, and, you know, getting it out of the Pacific to a designated facility is very difficult due to distance and expense. So I'm sure my colleagues will touch on that a little bit further during their sessions.
Okay, we have another question. We have a comment from Lekima. She says, interesting footnotes, especially number 7, hard to recover remediation money if a company packs up and leaves behind asbestos, for instance. Yes, that's a good
Yes, absolutely. It's very difficult, and
Yeah.
you know, we can do what we can, but sometimes it's impossible to get the money back, you know.
Yeah. There's one from Edward. One way to address the historical pollution before undertaking a new development is to have an environment bond. My question is, do you have a standard for determining environment bonds?
No, I'm not aware of a standard within the World Bank ESF for determining environment bonds. I'm just looking to see if any of my colleagues are on board or online. I see, Joyce, you're still online. Have you ever seen an environment bond used on our projects?
Hi, Bonnie. Did you mean environment bond for any of our projects?
Yeah, exactly. Like, have you ever seen that used? I haven't. I'm not familiar with you know, any of our historical projects. Have we done that before? Are you aware of it? Is there a standard for that? Sorry to put you on the spot. I don't know the answer to the question.
That's okay. I think in terms of environment bond, we haven't used it widely in our projects, but potentially in PNG, we might have used that, but not widely. And I guess under the ESF, we haven't done that for any of our projects under the ESF.
Bonnie,
Thanks.
there has been cases where we don't specifically have an environment bond, but within the procurement documents, we do put a safeguards bond on the CESMP to ensure that it follows the environment management plan. And so we have looked at putting a bond on that.
Yeah, thanks, Malachi. We have used that to try and make sure that contractors include enough costs to implement their the ESMP and don't undercost it.
Okay, we've now got a few questions here for you, Bonnie. Edwin asks, can can unexploded ordnance be classified as historical pollution, considering that some of these sites are littered with from World War II?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good point, Edwin. In Solomon Islands, especially, we find many of our sites have UXO, and we should be following the historical pollution processes, and we do consider those. Although I don't think you're going to have any luck trying to find someone to pay for that, you know, the people who place that to pay for their removal. But we definitely do need to consider it as historical pollution.
Okay, thank you. We'll just take one more question before we move on to our next presenter, please. Margaret says, please share World Bank standards for water quality, and are World Bank standards region specific?
Thanks, Margaret. No, the standards are not region specific, and yes, I can. I'll find them and I'll send them around and share them with everyone. So I might finish there. Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks, Afira, for
Thanks, Bonnie.
facilitating. And I'll hand over to Alan and Afira.
Okay, I'll just share my screen here. There it is. Is that sharing? Am I sharing there? Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes.
We
Okay.
can see Ellen.
All right, well, hello everybody, and especially to those participants who I know personally, those from the Solomon Islands and Fiji. I won't start saying names because I'm sure to miss somebody out. So, but, I've seen names there, and some of you will have, I know personally, and have presented some of these things to you before, but hopefully it's not the same. So my presentation today is on construction-related pollution control and waste management, which is my main area of experience in regard to these issues. It's really aimed at practical field application and reflects the key concerns of international partners, what they would expect to see, for example, in an environmental management plan or a construction environmental management plan. So for pollution control and waste management, and for, in fact, all construction environmental impacts, there are 4 key strategies, and these are just 4 common key strategies. Firstly, avoidance. This means this is best used during the initial planning of a project, and it may involve changing the location, changing the design or the technology to avoid impacts on sensitive receivers, whether they be ecological, physical, or social receptors, people, institutions, hospitals, people's homes, schools, etc. And then the second, if you can't avoid, then it's minimize, and that brings in the whole issue of abatement controls, operational controls such as using silt curtains to stop silt in a marine environment, for example, containment areas, minimizing waste at source, and as mentioned before, efficient procurement, not over-ordering materials for site, but procuring efficiently so that you're not going to get too many leftovers, too much waste at the end. The third, if you can't minimize, you can't avoid, you can't minimize, then it's a restoration, reinstate the ecosystem. And this is typically occurs at the end of a construction project. That means removal of stockpiles and equipment. Don't leave them there for people, and I know in the Pacific Islands it's a real problem because you have islands scattered everywhere, and contractors will spend a lot of money getting their equipment to these islands, and then they might, at the end of the construction, it's too expensive for them to remove it, so they'll just leave it there, and that does happen. It's very important to restore the environment, make sure that the contractors will actually remove their equipment, remove their stockpiles, and as mentioned before, sometimes they can provide stockpiles or even some equipment to local communities to use at the end of a construction project. And it also means cleaning up any contaminated areas, if there's been any spillages or any kind of hazardous materials that have been left that are at the end of the construction. It's very important that that gets cleaned up before the contractor leaves. And then finally, if you can't restore, then there's compensation. And this particularly is with reference to any loss of biodiversity, ecological impacts, for example, and also pollution and waste. So these are the 4 key strategies that make up what is referred to as the mitigation hierarchy, if you like. But always important in dealing with waste and dealing with pollution control, have those 4 things in mind. Firstly, avoid. If you can, that's the best way to mitigate. Minimize. If you can't minimize, then restore, and certainly compensation also. So now looking at water pollution, what are some of the sources of water pollution? Well, surface and groundwater can be impacted by hydrocarbons, of course, pollution from fuels and lubricating oils used in construction projects, silt and cement, silt from just normal excavation and cement, for example, from concrete batching plants that can provide, raise the pH of water and be dangerous to surface water quality. Sewage from construction camps, that's another source of water pollution in construction projects. And polluted groundwater discharge. This can happen when when pollution goes through the soil into the groundwater and can cause pollution of water bodies a distance away from where the construction is ongoing. And chemicals used during construction is another source of pollution. And as mentioned before, invasive species, bringing invasive species in from other countries can cause significant effects on biodiversity. So just looking at water pollution here, oil spills are the second most common cause of water pollution after silt. Silt is the most common one. And as you can see on the right-hand side, when silt gets into water bodies, it can really affect fish, for example. When fine silt can affect their gills and cause fish kills in water bodies. So it's a very significant source of pollution from construction projects, particularly in areas of very high rainfall, like you have in the Pacific Islands. The photo on the left shows the result of a pipeline fracture caused by the use of heavy vehicles on a temporary site road. And that pipeline fracture resulted in pollution of this from a nearby water body. So these are all potential kinds of effects of water pollution from construction. Looking at protection measures, chemicals, oils and silt are the most common water pollutants, and they can be contained. So you can see in that bottom bottom picture, that diagram of where storage of oils or storage of hydrocarbons need to be in containment facilities, so that there's any spillage, it gets contained within that containment. Having oil spill kits on hand, very important all the time on a construction site. These should be mandatory in any construction site. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see a silt curtain where you're containing sediments that have been put into suspension and protecting water bodies. This is very important in port works and in the Pacific Islands, where you have sensitive ecological ecosystems like corals, etc., but very sensitive to silt in the water columns, and it's very important when dredging is undertaken that silt curtains are used properly and efficiently. Soil impacts. Soil contamination is one of the highest risks, and this can occur through chemicals and oils, or it can also occur through landslides caused by construction activities. Heavy vehicle traffic on temporary construction site roads. So wherever there are steep slopes, there's a possibility of landslides due to water or overloading. These things must be considered in your environmental management plans or your construction or the contracts construction environmental management plans. Excuse me. Here is an example of where an oil spill, a significant oil spill during construction has just on the side of the road has resulted in this oil going onto the land, and that in this particular case, the oil has got into the groundwater and polluted nearby water wells from nearby villages. So this is a very significant kind of impact. So it needs to be, you need to make sure that the contractor is controlled when these sorts of things happen, that there is a control to clean that up, and again to reinstate if the community is affected through their polluted water supply, then the contractor will be required to compensate their water supply through providing fresh water from somewhere else. So these are common sorts of things in construction if it's not properly mitigated and not properly controlled. Soil protection. In this particular case, providing it's necessary to provide impervious areas. You can see on that slide there, there is some fabric that's put underneath the construction site just to contain any potential spills that might go into the soil. So there needs to be an assessment of the risks of disturbing contaminated soil in the pre-construction phase. And so, and measures taken to ensure that the soil is not affected. And here we can use what we call the source pathway receptor assessments, where you identify what is the source of pollution. Have you got potential source of pollution, say for example a fuel depot? What is the pathway for that pollution? Pathway may be along the surface of the ground, or it could be under the ground through groundwater. And then what are your potential receivers? It could be a water body that it could be an ecological system, or it could be a water body where people are using that water body for daily or potable water supply. So that's the way of kind of assessing what potential impacts on soil pollution could be, by identifying what your source of pollution might be, identifying what the pathway of that potential pollution source is, and then identifying what are your sensitive receptors that are vulnerable to that pollution. Soil erosion. Exposed soil. This is a classic problem in construction. Exposed soil on a gradient has a high risk of erosion, and it can be a major problem in construction activities, resulting in the loss of fertile soil, the loss of habitats, pollution of water bodies, and landslides, of course. It can be minimized by the use of vegetation mats used to stabilize loose rock, check dams or gabions, which reduce the velocity and intensity of the eroding media, which in this case is water. And here's some other measures for soil protection during construction: minimizing and preventing and reducing erosion through minimizing the length of the slopes, relocating any temporary structures that may cause, it might be relocating a cofferdam to a better situation that will reduce sedimentation, minimize the grade and maximize flow resistance of any channels, use wide channels rather than V channels to reduce the velocity, use armor, as you can see in the right-hand picture there, using armor reinforcements such as gabions and geotech fabric to strengthen the banks, and then conserve topsoil and vegetation, or restore the vegetation. And you can see in the bottom picture, after those measures have been put in during the construction phase, the vegetation is allowed to grow back. And what's happened by putting in those gabion measures, that you've protected the banks, you've protected the surrounding environment from significant erosion that would otherwise occur if that strengthening and that protection didn't happen. And here's just, I found this quite a useful summary schematic showing how runoff from a disturbed area during a road construction is managed and treated. And this is from a project in New Zealand, and we can just perhaps go through this. On the top, you can see down in the middle here, we have the main face of the new road that is being constructed. On the upper left-hand side here, we have a cut face that is happening. And before the cut face is begun to be excavated, there should be a channel at the top, a diversion channel, so that water is not allowed, actually is prevented from flowing onto the cut face. And then of course you have revegetating of the cut face as soon as possible. As the construction proceeds, as the road proceeds, revegetate as soon as possible, have progressive stabilization of the earthworks, and most importantly, around the site, wherever there is runoff, wherever the construction, there should be runoff channels that are leading to a sediment retention ponds. In the case of where there's concrete batching, there should be chemical treatment to reduce the pH. Again, down actually at the construction phase down here, again, sediment traps, channels and sediment traps are the best ways to reduce erosion and prevent sedimentation, prevent siltation of a nearby sensitive receptor. And we've got the sensitive receptor here, which is a stream with biodiversity in it, with fish, etc. And we've got the ocean estuary here. And you can see how after the runoff gets settled, gets treated in these settlement or treatment ponds, then there's an outlet pipe that takes relatively clean water that is finally discharged into the environment. And then we have also a silt fence that is another area of protection. So this is just a schematic that shows the sorts of erosion protection, siltation protection measures that a good contractor or any contractor should be putting in place. And that's what we would expect to see in environmental management plans and in a contractor's construction environmental management plan. We would like to see in a contractor's environmental management plan something akin to this kind of diagram, just to demonstrate exactly what measures he's got in place, that he's assessed the area, he's assessed the vulnerability of the area where he's building, and that he's taken appropriate measures specific to that particular area of construction. So this is the kind of detail that we would like to see in construction environmental management plans when it comes to pollution control in a construction project. Now, turning to waste impacts, we have there's general construction waste, of course. There is sewage, which we've talked about. There is food waste from canteen, metals, etc. Hazardous waste, asbestos needs to be treated properly. Brought in specialist removal of asbestos needs to be undertaken in a careful way. Chemicals that can be discarded, electronics, transformer oil, refrigerants, and then debris and residue from enabling works. These are all the different types of waste streams that you get from a construction site. And many countries are taking a very hard line on management and disposal of construction waste, and particularly hazardous waste and contaminated waste. And a waste management plan, as part of a construction environmental management plan, must deal with the waste handling and disposal of all of these different waste streams. The waste management plan must assess what wastes are going to be produced and have a plan for each of the particular types of waste. And here we have just some examples of how waste can be separated. You can see on the top left corner, there are a series of waste bins where we've got different types of waste streams that can be separated at source. And waste management should cover the generation of the waste, the segregation of it, the storage of it, transport of it, and of course the final disposal of it. And the key thing about waste management is that there needs to be planning in advance that this needs to happen early on during the preparation of the construction environmental management plan. There needs to be detailed planning as to how these various waste streams are going to be dealt with. And that needs to be written very carefully in a construction environmental management plan. And for those of us who have to review those, and those of you who are in institutions where you are reviewing contractors' environmental management plans, it's very important that they get this management done, written into their plan, so very specifically, so you can see just how they're going to manage their waste. Otherwise, if they go and start doing it, go and start their construction work without having an approved management plan in place. They would just do it ad hoc, and you know, it will be a disaster. So it's very important that the contractor has thought very carefully about how he's going to deal with his various waste streams on site. And this is the classic waste management hierarchy, if you like. Again, very similar to the strategy to just normal impact, dealing with environmental impact strategy. Firstly, prevention. Prevent waste. If you can reduce the amount, or just if you can prevent having any waste, for example, making sure that you don't over order, that the contractor doesn't over order or gets too much material into site. This is very important in efficient resource use. So prevention is always best in terms of waste management. If you can't prevent, then of course minimization of waste. If it's not created in the first place, then problems won't arise. Then reuse, of course. You can reuse wastewater, waste timber, various leftover structural materials on work sites, and can reduce the need for new materials. This is just this good, efficient waste management planning. And then if you can't reuse, then recycle. And sometimes that can involve providing waste to local communities, whether it be excess spoil, whether it can be other facilities or machinery that the contractor doesn't want to take away. It can be recycled, given to local communities. Energy recovery, if possible. It can be, you know, in some situations, waste can be turned into energy through burning, whether it's biomass or other types of waste. And then finally, disposal. That's the least option. So as you can see, this hierarchy should always be, when a contractor is thinking about or developing his environmental management, his waste and management plan, it should be prevention should be the first thing that comes to mind, minimization, reuse, recycling, energy recovery, and finally disposal. So in summary, when looking at management of pollution control and waste management, the 4 mitigation strategies should be used to limit construction impacts: avoidance, minimization, restoration, and compensation. And then employ internationally recognized good construction practices, and all contractors should be made aware, they should be aware of those, but we often find that contractors in the Pacific Islands think they're an easy touch, and they don't have the same stringent requirements and legal requirements that they do in some more developed countries like Australia and New Zealand. The contractors know full well that they can't do this sort of thing, but it comes in the Pacific Islands. My experience is that contractors think that they can just get away with not spending money on dealing with their waste and pollution control. Very important that that they are called to account to ensure good international practices are required. Pollution control, water pollution, soil impacts, and then waste management planning, the hierarchy. So in summary, that's just a very short practical presentation on some of the issues relating to construction management of waste construction management and pollution control. So if anybody has any questions, please fire away.
Thank you for that, Ellen. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Now we get the opportunity to our participants for any questions. Please feel free to type it in our chat box or raise your hand. We do have some questions here from Irina. Oh, sorry, we've got one here now, sorry. Yes, Berina, she asks, how would you go about managing an existing impact that was already there prior to works starting? Example, on family land, but is outside our environmental assessment scope or jurisdiction, but will somehow be impacted by the project.
Yeah, well, that's something that really has to be dealt with by the, before construction begins. It needs to be identified, any legacy issues of waste. I mean, the contractor will be taking no responsibility for that. So what needs to happen is that these kind of legacy issues or issues that are there prior to construction beginning they really need to be dealt with by the implementing agency or the executing agencies before the contractor gets there, because you can rest assured that he will not be taking any responsibility for existing environmental issues. And it's something that it's a good point to be raised, because during the preparation of bidding documents, for example, these issues should be determined. They actually should be determined in the environmental impact assessment, of course, in the planning, in the pre-planning. Those potential existing legacy issues should have been addressed in the environmental impact assessment prior to construction. So it very much goes back onto the project proponent to ensure that those issues are dealt with prior to construction beginning. I hope that answers your question, but I'm just going to say that a contractor, unless something's written into a contract, he won't take any responsibility for anything pre-existing unless it's clearly specified in his contract.
That's right. There's a comment here from Shana. She says it's one thing to plan and implement, but it's also another to enforce compliance. Monitoring compliance should be a collaborative effort between supervising team and implementing agency, and also government agencies such as the Ministry of Environment, or done through PUMA here in Samoa.
Yes, that's a very good point. And it's always about the implementation, and it's always about enforcement. And the most important thing about making sure implementation is to make sure that in the contracts and in the bidding document, when it's prepared, and in the contract document, there are clear enforcement measures. Penalties, for example, are in there, and that are tools that can be used to ensure that the contractor does actually implement these measures. If there is no enforcement there, then the contractor will just ignore the problem. And the best way to deal with a contractor is to make him pay for something to clean up, or that's the best enforcement measure, some kind of fiscal measure that enforces him to control. And the only way you can really do that effectively is to ensure that your bidding document or your contract document has those controls actually embedded in there, specific controls and specific measures. Because otherwise, the contractor will use his own lawyers to get out of any having to, if you try and prosecute him, he'll do whatever he can to get out of that. So it really comes down to having robust contract documents that provide enforcement measures for him to do it. It's all very well to go and do your monitoring and everything, but if the contractor, if there is no clear contractual requirement or any kind of way of enforcement, he won't do it, no matter how good your monitoring is.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And that's why it's very important to have those construction EMPs that we can also attach to the contract to make them responsible during the works, right?
Yes.
Ellen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we have this last question here before we go to our next presenter. This question I think is for Bonnie. This is from Sally Bita. what is the flexibility between the national procedures and World Bank procedure to be used in any project?
Thanks, Sally. That's a great question. So the World Bank procedures, and I assume you're talking about the environmental and social framework here, they do allow for flexibility and adoption of national procedures wherever possible. So really the requirement is to adopt the more stringent of the two procedures. So if you have a national policy and a World Bank policy, whichever is more stringent should be the one that you use. So in some cases, the World Bank might have additional requirements. So you might use the World Bank procedures, but for example, if we talked about the water quality standards, if you have a national water quality standard, and when you compare it with the World Bank ESHS guidelines, and it's more stringent, then absolutely it can be used. And even if it is in some cases less stringent, I think there is a little bit of flexibility so long as we are meeting the intentions of the ESF, because the ESF is meant to be scaled to your project risks. So it's something that can be discussed during the preparation of projects.
Okay, thanks for that, Bonnie. I hope that's answered your question, Sally. So now we are on to our third presenter, Ms. Rieko. Thank you.
Thank you, Afina, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm just going to share my screen on my side. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yeah, we can see it. Rieko.
Okay, thank you for that confirmation, Afira. So yeah, thank you very much once again for inviting me to this great training. I think it's been a learning process for me because, okay, so let me firstly introduce myself. As Afira already kindly introduced me in the beginning of the training, my name is Rieko Kubota. You can call me Rico. I'm a senior environmental engineer of the World Bank. I'm a technical specialist on waste management, wastewater management, plastic waste management, and circular economy agenda of the bank. So what I'm usually doing is that I'm actually doing a lot of technical design of the project that's related to the waste management, and also for any other sectoral projects like some of the projects like health sector, educational sector, there's always an aspect of waste management. So I try to make sure that the waste management is well addressed and integrated in that the technical design and the project activities of the World Bank project. And that's what I'm usually doing. Unfortunately, I don't have much Pacific experience working in a region, which I really hope to work with all of you here in the region very soon. But my example is that's coming from the other region where I usually work with, which is the ASEAN region in East Asia. So I think Bonnie and Alan has already given a very good examples and principles of that ESF and how it's being considered in the project management. What I'm going to discuss a little bit more into details here is that about this environmental health and safety guideline. We call it EHS guidelines in short. Bonnie already has mentioned several times in her presentation that we have this EHS guideline, and we do have these EHS guidelines for different sectors. We have one for example, road construction, bridge construction, hospital management. We have one for that different industry. Thus, we do have a EHS guideline for waste management as well. So I would like to just briefly introduce what is inside the EHS guideline for the waste management and how it's been applied in the World Bank projects. And after that, I give a very brief example of how I usually conduct the project preparation to make sure that the waste management is appropriately considered and addressed in that World Bank project in 2 of the projects that I have recently worked on. I just realized that it's not in the presentation mode, sorry. Okay, so environmental and health and safety guidelines. So EHS guideline is the guideline for the waste management, which is usually general waste like food waste, plastic, or wood waste. Those are what we call non-hazardous waste because it doesn't usually cause pollution. But and there are other waste streams called hazardous materials such as the pesticides and also batteries, electric appliances with a lot of metals inside, so on and so forth. So depending on that different waste stream and the different waste value chain, we have a specific guidance that the World Bank project should follow. And we call it a waste value chain, but we have to give enough and appropriate consideration for the appropriate waste management from the waste prevention stage. So how we can prevent and reduce the amount of the waste, and also how we can control the generation and how we can make sure that the waste is separated appropriately, and storage, collection, transportation, all the way to the landfill. So we have to give consideration all along this waste value chain from that prevention stage to the landfill. And the guideline also provides a direction on how the World Bank project should design and project activities and infrastructures. So, as I've said, the World Bank project sometimes has the projects for the waste management, or the projects are for the different sector like infrastructure or energy or health or so on. But we have to always make sure whenever the waste management is part of the project that we need to make sure how we can safely manage both the general and hazardous waste. So in the project, we need to establish the waste management priorities, which I think Alan has very clearly explained. We also respect the waste hierarchy that Alan has already explained very well. We do prefer having the waste prevention as the first priority. And as the last priority, of course, it is a landfill, because there's no more use of those waste that would be put into the landfill. So we have to manage the waste to try to minimize the waste amount that goes into the landfill. And of course, we have to assess that all the potential environmental, health, and safety risk that is arising from the waste generation, and also that waste management in the along the waste value chain. And as Alan has already said, that we have to avoid and minimize the waste as far as practical. And this word practical is the key word here, that we are not assuming to really strictly enforce the minimization and avoidance of the waste in whatever the possible way. But we also think that this practicality is the important aspect that we need to consider in, because in many of the developing countries' context, there are not enough infrastructure or waste management system in place. So we have to also consider the practicality when we apply such kind of guidelines for that waste management. And again, as Alan said, where waste cannot be recovered or reused for any other purposes, waste must be treated with environmentally sound manner. So when there is no opportunity for recycling or reuse of the waste, that we have to make sure that the safe disposal is happening at the landfill site, or it's not going to be illegally dumped in a public area where the waste is not supposed to dispose, and so on and forth, which also relates to the compliance and monitoring issue that some of you have raised as a question. But these are some of the guidelines that are specified in our EHS guidelines. And also it touches upon that how to select the appropriate waste management technologies and methods in the projects. So the selection of the appropriate method and technologies should depend on the local capacities, resources, and the context. So again, we are not seeking for ideal, very advanced waste management technology or system in place for wherever that we implement the project. But we do the project preparation and we take time to do that many times that it takes more than a year to prepare the project and conduct the feasibility study of all the projects, just because that we want to respect and we want to consider that local capacities and where are the resources and what kind of context that the local situation has in terms of the waste management. So of course, we don't recommend incineration in every country's context because it costs a lot of energy, it costs a lot of environmental impact if there's no safety device attached to the incineration and so on. So we do consider such kind of a local characteristics, I would say, and also environmental, economic, and social situation when we do the selection of that waste management method and technology. Okay, so EHS guideline, of course, touches on both on the general and hazardous waste, but it has covered quite extensively on how to treat the hazardous waste in the water tank projects. Just because hazardous waste has a bigger negative impact when it is not safely treated or disposed. So that is why hazardous waste is always a priority issue, and how we can make sure the separation from the non-hazardous waste is really essential when we consider the waste management system in the water tank projects. And when we consider the hazardous waste management, the basic principle is that we want to prevent that hazardous waste as much as possible. And we try to understand the potential impacts and the risks associated with the management of any generated hazardous waste during its complete life cycle. So, for example, I think some construction activities use a lot of paintings, right? That the paint that is also considered as a hazardous waste because it has contained a lot of chemicals inside. And if it's drained into the water, that it can pollute the groundwater as well. So we need to assess such kind of risks during all the life cycle of the product of the paint. So this is very essential to identify those risks before the project starts. And as some of that questions has already discussed, that we need to also ensure that contractors who will be handling and disposing of this hazardous waste have reputable and also legitimate enterprises. And we do usually recommend to contract with a licensed contractor, which has already complied to the regulation by the relevant regulatory agencies or government bodies of the country, and also follow the good international industrial practices where there is no local regulation or local rules available. And by that we want to make sure that that all these waste handling practices of the hazardous waste is ensuring compliance with, of course, applicable local and international regulations. And again, this is always coming as an issue when it comes to project implementation stage, but the regular monitoring and inspection of waste storage, it should be regularly conducted so that we don't, we can assess and we can prevent that the significant environmental risk happening at the waste storage or waste disposable site and so on and forth by having this kind of monitoring and inspections in place. And we also advise very strongly to inspect the carriers of the hazardous waste, such as containers, vessels, cars, and so on, which carry and transport the waste to the disposal site. Because many times that we have observed that in developing countries, the vehicles and carriers are quite old, and it's sometimes broken, but it has not been very well maintained. So we also try our best to give the suggestion to inspect the carriers, because we have also observed many cases that there has been a lot of leakage of those hazardous waste, especially when that hazardous waste is a liquid form, then it's quite easy to drip from the vessels and vehicles. And these are something that we also want to avoid, because that might consequently has a direct human contact to those hazardous waste. And we also recommend to establish a manifest system for that, for what kind of hazardous waste that the project is generating, for what amount and what kind of risks that you already assessed. So this manifest form is that ideal system to control and monitor those hazardous waste. So this is just a very quick introduction of the EHS guideline for the waste management. And I just stop here very shortly. If you have any questions or comments, maybe you can just put it in a chat box and we can cover that later, and we'll just run through the presentation if you don't mind, Afira.
Yes, that's a good plan, Reiko. Thank you very much for your presentation. I will leave the remaining questions after Bradley's presentation, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay. Afira, before I hand over to Bradley, can I just quickly show you one case study that I have done for the project?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me just do this very, very quickly. So when I prepare the waste management projects and all the World Bank project steps, that the same process, we usually do conduct this waste composition analysis to understand what kind of waste is actually generated in those areas where we are going to implement the project. So this is very, very standard survey that we conduct. And we identify what kind of waste that we need to deal with, if there are, what kind of hazardous waste that is generated in the area, and so on. So in the project that I have worked in Laos very recently, many of the waste is organic waste, which is food waste, garden waste, the trees and leaves, plants, and so on and forth. And we have identified very few hazardous items. It was not really reflected in this graph here. It's in others. But yeah, so we find that this kind of a waste composition at the very beginning. And then we also conduct a waste stream analysis. So we will identify what kind of volume of the waste that we would need to deal with, and in what way that is generated. So in our example, that it was generated as a mixed waste, right? So it was not separated. It was just coming in one bag as a mixed waste, right? So we thought that it would be better to have a sorting or recycling plant, so that manually and also automatically, mechanically, that we can sort out all the recyclable waste and also the compost waste and the hazardous waste at that sorting plant. And we do this technical design of the sorting plant afterwards, so that we can make sure to minimize the waste that goes into the landfill and try to accord with the waste hierarchy. So what we are really trying to do in a technical design of the waste management project is that we want to minimize the waste that goes into the landfill, and we want to maximize the waste that goes into that recycling process that will be eventually be sold to those recyclers or informal waste pickers. So this is just a typical design of the sorting center. We will go through, after accepting the waste at that recycling center, we go through all these different mechanical processes so that it can be sorted out and it can be brought into the recycling process once again for that material recycling or energy recovery and so on and forth. So this is the kind of technical design that we usually do for the waste management project. And for all the residual waste that arises from this process, of course, we need to design an environmentally sound landfill site, right? So we do have a different technical designs to make sure that we don't pollute the soil, groundwater, surface water, and also the surrounding agricultural lands and so on and forth. So yeah, this is something that we do collaborate very strongly with that ESF team, who is much more familiar with the ESS 3 standard and the other standards that are prepared by the World Bank and the other international standards. And also we tried our best to relocate the existing waste, which is usually open dump, but we try to safely manage and close those open dumps so that we can make new landfill sites that can be disposing in a much safer manner. And also we usually attach the leachate treatment facility. Leachate means that it's the wastewater coming out from that waste. So usually it's seeping out from the bottom of the landfill, and it's very, it's quite hazardous because it has been concentrated wastewater coming from all the type of waste that has been put inside that landfill. So this is again required in the EHS guideline to have a proper wastewater management system at the landfill site as well. So I think considering the time, I'll stop here. And yeah, if you have any questions or any clarification about what I have talked or anything about the waste management projects of the World Bank, I'm happy to answer. And thank you very much for your kind attention. Back to you, Avila.
Thank you for that, Rieko. Very helpful and informative presentation. We have a question here from Margaret. She asks, can you please share a case study experience with handling of solid and liquid waste from slaughterhouse?
Okay, slaughterhouse means, sorry, I'm not very familiar with the word slaughterhouse. Is that a kind of informal inhabitants or, sorry?
For meat.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, so usually, so this is not the World Bank project, but it's my experience from my other professional background. But for the slaughterhouse, that I think a lot of issue is about that that agricultural waste, right? It is decomposable, meaning that after there is appropriate treatment of those solid waste coming from that meat industry, then we usually do have a kind of a treatment process to accelerate the decomposing. And also the liquid waste, it must have a very good wastewater treatment facility because it contains a lot of blood and the kind of the body waste, we call it. So that needs to have a quite advanced devices attached to this kind of wastewater treatment facility. So we do have standards, international standards for the different industries. I'm not sure if we have that industrial standards under EHS for that industry, but I think there are EHS guidelines for the agricultural sector. So maybe this is something that could be referable for your projects for the meat industry.
Okay, I think that's the only question we have so far that we can ask Rieko at this time.
Okay.
We'll ask a few more general questions after Bradley's presentation, but thank you, Rieko.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bradley.
Excellent, thank you. I will attempt to share my screen, everyone. Okay, is that coming through okay, Fira?
Yes, yes. Looks
Fantastic.
good, Bradley.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm conscious that we're a little over the expected time, so I'll attempt to go through this reasonably quickly. Essentially, what I'm looking to do is just close the loop on all of the presentations and back into where we started with Bonnie's work, and recognise that ESS has a place more broadly even inside of dedicated waste management projects. So I'll quickly work through the process that that SPREP has. Just for those of you who are unfamiliar with myself and the work of PACWaste Plus, we're a European Union funded project across 15 countries in the Pacific and Timor-Leste. We're implementing projects looking at hazardous waste, asbestos, e-waste and healthcare, solid waste across those areas that you can see, and a little bit of wastewater with our partnership with SPC. And we've got 4 key result areas around data information education, legislative assistance and frameworks, on-ground activities and best practice implementation of works, and capacity building. So covering the whole gamut of project activities that can occur, as I say, throughout the entire Pacific. And you'll see far to the left, Timor-Leste also included, even though they're sitting outside of the Pacific Ocean. The reality is the work that we've heard Bonnie and Alan and Rieko talk about is the core ESS considerations for waste management work. The focus on what am I about to do, what waste am I about to create, and is there a way to reduce, to avoid, and to mitigate any of those responses is vitally important in any activity that we do. We're really wanting to make sure that not only direct but perverse impacts from project activities are dealt with. And I know that this is a World Bank presentation, but I thought it might be useful to quickly reflect on the ESS process thinking that SPREP implements for all of its projects, regardless of what thematic area they are focusing on, whether it be waste, climate, or oceans, islands and ecosystems, with the intent here of recognising that there may well be other impacts to waste-based work that might influence decisions that need to be made. So the typical assessment process looking at consequence and likelihood is applied across our ESS assessments. And when we look at our assessments, we consider both principles and safeguards. So human rights, gender equality, child protection, climate change impacts, biodiversity impacts, and waste management principles are all considered. Realistically here, we're wanting to make sure, even though we're seeking for PACWaste Plus based actions, a solid improvement to waste management and environmental protection, what are the impacts on the proposed activity in terms of human rights around gender equality? Is the project that we're about to put in that will provide a waste management solution, is it actually going to be causing community harm, or in fact impacting on one sector of community more than others? And is that fair, and is there another way of designing that system so that there can be equal opportunity for engagement and benefit to come from that? And likewise, some of the other presenters have spoken about, and there was a question around cumulative impact. We get the opportunity to think of that. Is this system that we're proposing to put in actually going to create some perverse impact for greenhouse gas emission? Is it going to be harming a sector of the ecosystem that we hadn't thought of? So how do we actually work through that system? Principle 6 is very much looking at the waste management systems, and Alan covered some of those on-ground actions very well, and Rieko again with the health and safety considerations. So all of those feed into the general assessment. Moving past that though, we move into our safeguards, and we've got a number of safeguards that are considered here. That assessment of management of environmental and social risks and impacts. What is the public participation in information disclosure? How can people actively engage and influence the work? What is that accountability and grievance process, and can there be conflict resolution if we find that there is impacted communities that we hadn't thought of? What are those labour and working conditions that are built in, and is it appropriate? Do they match the SDGs? And how can we improve how work is done in each jurisdiction that we might be proposing to implement an intervention? What is that resource efficiency, going back into that hierarchy that Alan presented, and how can we ensure that the project that is proposed is the best for the situation in which it's being placed? How can we ensure that community health and safety and security is guaranteed through the proposed works? Some broader impacts. Is there any impact on where people live and enjoy their environment? Will we actually be forcing a resettlement? And Alan made comment in some of these examples around asbestos work. Some of the work that Pack Waste Plus is being asked to assist with in Kiribati is on a very remote island that has a significant asbestos problem. But to undertake that work, we actually need to have people move from their current houses and industry because it is so full of asbestos. So how can we do that meaningfully, and is that the most appropriate way moving forward? So these considerations are quite significant, especially when talking to remote communities that may not have alternative options as readily as what we might find in some urban settlements. What are those biodiversity conservation, sustainable development actions, and how can we ensure that we're not creating, once again, perverse impacts? That cultural heritage and Indigenous peoples consideration as well. I think we would all agree that many of the problems facing the Pacific right now are from the introduction of Western thinking, as opposed to the Indigenous and traditional knowledge that has come from the region. So are there ways of capturing, enhancing and implementing structured traditional knowledge and recognition of those practices and that connection to land that will provide a significantly better outcome than just doing things the way it's done elsewhere in the world? To really try and talk about a waste project that might explain some of this thinking well, I have just got a couple of slides just showing some work that we're doing in Samoa. So Satoa and crew, thank you for the work that you have put in here, and I hope you don't mind me quickly showing people some of the thinking. So Samoa is looking at implementing an e-waste recovery program through the investment from Pack Waste Plus. The intent here is to create a legislative framework that will provide an incentive for people to return e-waste products, your computers, TVs, that type of thing, into a system. That incentive will be through a payment back, but also therefore requires a deposit put on the sale of the product initially. We would commonly understand this to be a container deposit legislation for cans and bottles that many countries already have, but looking to expand it out. So the issue here is we will have waste that will be consolidated. We will have the opportunity to build a facility and to train people on the appropriate dismantling, taking a waste, turning it into a commodity product that can be sold into the market. All of those waste management ESS considerations that were discussed by Bonnie, Alan, and Rieko would play out in how that system is designed, and as that building was happening, and all of the activities that go along with the structure of a system. But that broader ESS thinking, even though this is a waste project, really needs to look at those broader elements. So when we think about the objectives of our project, we were really saying it's around ensuring there is a strong and sustainable legislative environment that creates that enabling environment for industry to take a role. So how do we do that and protect the community and the environment in doing so? How can we ensure that there's an effective recovery system that's built? And how can we ensure that we have an engaged and informed community so they recognise the opportunity that exists with this work? With all of this, we needed to look at what are those core issues that we're trying to address to make sure that the intervention that is implemented deals with not only achieving those objectives, but ensuring that we've resolved those core issues. So that unsustainable practice of e-waste either being landfilled or disposed of antisocially through either illegal dumping or burning. Not having real strong national management schemes around safe handling and storage of hazardous wastes. And the simple fact that at the moment, that product, if it's going into landfill, is taking up a valuable resource that exists and needs to be protected so that those items that we don't actually have a solution for are dealt with. So with those core issues, the identification of that legal framework for establishment, the management of the e-waste, the treatment facilities, the knowledge and capacity for the management of that material, and establishing that fully functional and self-sustaining and sustainable finance system is where we were looking to go. When we ran that project through our ESS screening process, we found that we triggered a number of things. So looking at the safeguard around assessment and management of those environmental and social risks, we identified that this project, although providing a very strong environmental and waste management outcome, did have the potential that the financial burden that such a scheme may put on people might mean that there are sections of the community that may not be able to purchase the product they were thinking of initially. Because unlike a beverage container, 5 or 10 cene placed on a container that you consume very quickly and can come back relatively quickly, that's not the case. If you're buying a TV, you're hoping it's lasting for 5 to 10 years. Same with a computer and other e-waste products. So there is a burden on the individual depending on how high that financial deposit was before they can redeem that at end of life. So how does this system, although it's producing that environment and that waste management outcome, how can we address that, that broader sustainability outcome that comes from actually having costs on individuals? And similarly, that leads on to the next one, the determination of that levy cost. What is the real need of the cost on the system? But similarly, what is the capacity of the impacted and regulated community to meet that cost? And is there different ways in which we can structure that system so that that cost can be reduced? Do we need to do all of the dismantling and processing in country? Or can we have a system that that captures that product and can it be moved offshore so that the processing happens elsewhere and costs are reduced? But in doing so, are we actually impacting on potential employment in country and whatnot? So there's some very complex thinking that needs to go into these systems past just, are we producing waste? Are we capturing that waste? Are we minimizing that waste? And making sure that the system and the intervention that is designed and applied actually provides the best overall outcome across everything, which, you know, this presentation series is all about ESS 3, but remembering the 3 indicates there's a 1 and a 2, and there are other considerations as well. So it's good to make sure that we do focus entirely on minimizing those waste management impacts, but remembering that when we start to bring in those other ESS considerations, they may influence, again, a design scope change on our projects to make sure that all of those outcomes are balanced across the area. Similarly, how does the refund work? Where can people go? What are the health and safety implications on the structure of that system based specifically on the activity that will be undertaken? How can we ensure effective operation, monitoring? All of these considerations are captured inside of that screening and help build a very strong and robust system so that not only our intervention here, which is seeking a sustainable financed solution for this waste, but actually has a stronger community sustainability to it. So I know I've moved through that relatively quickly, only provided the one example, but in the interest of time, I think that's the appropriate way to go. Back to you, Afira. I'm more than happy to answer some questions or have the floor consider all of the presenters together in a broader scope. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Bradley, for that very informative and helpful presentation. We do have some comments here, but please, everyone, feel free to type up your questions in our chat box or raise your hand. There is a question, or it's a comment. This is a comment from Shana. Oh, that we have someone online who wants to ask a question. Ali? Hello? Okay, maybe we've lost Ali there. Oh, this is a comment from Mandria. She says, if the international standards are used in absence of local standards, how effective then is enforcement and implementation in local context? International standards isn't always relevant to local context. And she goes on to say, and will make it difficult to identify practical indicators for local authorities to measure the impacts against and conduct their monitoring effectively and efficiently. Any comments from our panel?
I can come in on this one, Afira. I guess I completely agree. And I guess it's all about coming to an agreement on which standards will apply and making sure that you are meeting the needs of both your development partners, but also local authorities. And should they not have the capacity to monitor certain requirements, that would fall then to your project implementation unit themselves to monitor and make sure you're meeting your commitment as agreed to with the World Bank or other development partners. But agree, definitely we need to make sure everyone is kept happy and that local authorities are included in that process. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that, Bonnie. I'm sure that's answered your question. Then we've got some questions here. Oh, sorry, this one is from Margaret. Have I asked this question? Has the World Bank established codes of practices to implement these ESS standards? There's a lot of responsibility on people on the ground to apply these approaches, but without specific and relevant codes, it's not effective to conform with standards.
Sure, I can come in on that one again, if helpful. So it really is specific to each project, what kind of environmental management tool you use, but should your project risks be relatively small, we do have some standard environmental and social codes of practice which can be implemented. So those would relate to, for example, small construction projects if you're building buildings, offices, sheds, that sort of thing. And really we agree to that during project development. The borrower and the bank would agree to an appropriate instrument, and we do have those standard tools which can be used and which hopefully will make things easier during implementation.
Okay, thanks for that, Bonnie, and thanks for the question, Margaret. We have a question here from Elizabeth Tomata to Bradley on Safeguard 1, assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts mitigation. Only has SPREP and MNRE in MOU signing done an MOU signing? Shouldn't there be an MOU between the Ministry of Women, Community and Social Development and SPREP as well, specifically on the social risks impacts mitigation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mafira, and thanks for the question, Elizabeth. The reason that there's purely an MOU with MNRE and Samoa on this one, and apologies for everyone talking on a very specific issue here, is that the proponent for the work is MNRE as the recipient ministry. Part of the project design is for MNRE to lead those broader interministerial conversations, and I was under the impression that that work had been done with the Ministry of Women and Communities leading into that, and in particular we were looking at the proposed workforce being at risk elements of the community to physically operate and get the benefit of that particular facility. I would be more than happy to have some offline conversations directly with, but I do know our colleagues from MNRE are on the line, so we could also hear from them, but I do recognise that it's a broader conversation than the intent of this group. But yes, any affected community and sector that does have some representation should most definitely be brought into that conversation, and we would welcome that opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that answer, Bradley. That is a very good question indeed. We have another question for you, Bradley. This is from Margaret. How is the private sector engaged for the pack waste project?
Thanks again, and thanks very much, Margaret. The way that the donors have structured the project for Pack Waste Plus is that all of our work is directed by our participating countries and the focal ministries. So as projects are designed in terms of the focal element that we're dealing with, so if we take Samoa, that being e-waste, the design of the facility and the processes needed to affect that outcome, we would then be working with directly with, in that example, MNRE, and start to discuss with that industry group, and we are in discussions with the two industry associations in Samoa that may benefit from this work. But essentially all of the work that will come out in terms of linkages will be through tendered contracts in Samoa. That might be a build and operate, it might just be an operate, depending on how things move forward. So private industry is not a direct recipient, they will be a contracted recipient. All of our work is very much supporting governments and making sure the ownership is happening there. The design of our intervention is very much to build capacity and provide investment, but the ownership of the work is by the recipient governments and ministries, just to try to provide that ongoing sustainability past the investment from the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley, for that answer. I hope that's answered your question, Margaret. We do have no more questions. We have successfully addressed all of our questions that have been given by our participants. So thank you very much to our trainers for answering that. I will just now give the opportunity for any final remarks from our presenters before we wrap up our session.
Hi everyone, this is Bonnie again, just saying thank you very much to everyone for joining the session, and thank you, Afira, for acting as our facilitator and for your assistance in organising. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you from me as well. Many of you will have heard my voice or seen my face in different parts of the Pacific or through Zoom. Good to talk to you again, and always available to answer any of your queries offline and have a chat about anything, particularly where it relates to construction and contractors and that sort of thing. That's where I work. So good to see you and good to be part of this again. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again for Pilan and everyone, and also the participants of the training. It's my first time to join this training, but it has been a learning experience for me, and I'm hoping that I can work with you and if you, in a very near future. And I really hope that we can continue this conversation on waste management If anyone has any questions about the waste management, anything, please just drop me a line. Maybe you can contact Ovira to just connect us. Yeah, I'm available and happy to answer any of the questions that you might have on the waste management. Thanks once again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fira, and thanks everyone for participating. I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to my co-presenters and the insightful questions that have come from everyone. And I look forward to continuing implementing well-designed projects in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. On behalf of our PLP-ESS partners and all our participants today, we extend a great big thank you to all our presenters. Today, we are so very blessed to have been a part of your training session today. All the knowledge that you've shared, I am very positive that all of us will use it in our workplaces and be able to improve in our work, and also to share it with our fellow work colleagues so that we can become better and better in our work that we do to help our communities, and also to ensure that we have a safe environment where we live in our beautiful islands here in the Pacific. And so again, we would like to say thank you very much, everyone. May God bless you all, and that may you be continue to be blessed so that you can be a blessing to so many more ESS practitioners out there who need this training. And I would also like to extend a big thank you to our PLP partners who have made this training possible for all of us. Thank you to our World Bank, to the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, SPREP, and USB, always for all these wonderful trainings that help us in our work. And we are always grateful for that. And also a big thank you to all our participants. So good to see so many of our participants joining our trainings. Today we've had over 80 joining our session, and that's really good. And we are very happy to see that. And just some reminders, remember we have our next training session next Tuesday. And that's going to be another good session next Tuesday. That will be module 22 on management information systems. And that will be led by our Inform team from the SPREP, and that will be Mr. Paul Anderson leading our presenters next week. Also, please, another important reminder is to fill in your evaluation survey forms. I have uploaded the link, and it will also be emailed to you. Please remember to fill that in. That will determine your if you get your certificates. And also, you have to make sure that you join the whole duration of the training session, because that's also recorded. And so thank you very much again. I will now hand it over to Ms. Rachel Marburg from the World Bank for our closing remarks.
Look, many thanks, Ophira, and I am conscious of time, so it'll be extremely quick. I just wanted to add my thanks to all of the presenters. It was a really excellent session, and it's just fantastic to have so much knowledge in the Pacific and recognition of the Pacific context in terms of waste management, because it's very easy to look at other countries and other contexts and appreciate the technical elements that might be relevant to the Pacific, but the particular conditions of the Pacific and particularly the social conditions make it a really quite unique challenge. So I think our presenters are really clear about that today, and I think we'll all benefit from their knowledge and experience. So thank you everybody for joining on behalf of all of the PLP. It's been fantastic to see you. Thank you for your excellent facilitation, Ophira. Thanks to our trainers, and thanks to you, and hopefully see you all again next week. Thank you.
Bye, Sefa. Bye, Moon. Thanks, Moon. Thanks, Sally. Thank you, Lameko and Benjamin from Cook Islands. Thanks,